Hello, St. John's community, and welcome to our summer church history series on the Protestant Reformation. It came to my attention, or to my mind earlier today, that it was not put out who would be teaching this series. So for some of you, it might be an intense disappointment that it is myself and not Father Daniel or Father Umberto teaching this series. I have neither the wisdom or preaching capabilities of Father Daniel, nor the arresting sense of humor as Father Umberto. But I will do the best I can, and I'm very excited about it. For anyone who doesn't know me, my name is Danielle Kuhn. I'm the Director of Faith Formation here at St. John the Baptist Catholic Church. So I do RE, I teach RCIA, and I work with youth ministry. So as it happens, during the summer, all three of my different sort of arenas that I work in are kind of in a downtime. Because of that, I've wanted to take on extra things to do this summer. One has been the parish prattle videos that come out every Wednesday on this YouTube channel. I don't know if any of you have seen them. Basically, they're just interviews with different parishioners of our church that go up every Wednesday at 8 a.m. So yes, there will be one tomorrow featuring some of the youth of St. John the Baptist. So I'm doing that this summer, and then I'm also going to be doing this along with other things. These are not the only things I'm doing, but I wanted to keep a little bit busier this summer. I taught 75% of this class during the course of RE this past year. Unfortunately, due to COVID, we got cut short. So when I was teaching about the Catholic response to the Reformation, we only got really as far as the Jesuits, and unfortunately, we're stopped. But now is my opportunity to start again and get to teach maybe a broader community. And yeah, I'm really excited about it. I love talking about this stuff. So I want to start with that. Why do I enjoy talking about this period in history, specifically like this period in church history? And there are three different reasons for this. One is you can dive pretty deeply into different theological issues from discussing this time period in history. Obviously, the Reformation, Protestants breaking away from the Catholic Church occurred because of theological disagreements and arguments. And they started kind of in one place, and then you see as the Reformation goes on how these initial disagreements lead to all these other divisions in theology. And I think that's really fascinating, and it gives us a time and kind of a place to explore more of our own Catholic theology and why we believe what we do instead of believing what the Protestants believe. So one great starting point to talk about theological issues. Two, you really come to a new understanding of the church when you look at this time period in history. You really get a different, you get to look at the church's flaws. And I love that, not because I love looking at all the ways the church has failed over the years, but because in these flaws, in looking at the ways that the church throughout history has been wounded and imperfect, you really get to see the beautiful way that God defends and preserves his church, even amidst all these different imperfections. It, for me, I think, gives hope for our time. I think there's a tendency of people to always think that they're living in the worst time, that, oh my gosh, our era now is just the worst. There's never been such a depraved time period in history. But when you look back at different periods throughout history, specifically in church history, you can see, this is not the only time that the church has been a little wounded, recovering from kind of getting beaten a little bit. There have been many times in history where the church has been a little wounded because of imperfections. And every time God takes that wound and makes it an opportunity for renewal, strengthening, purification, and really building back up his church. And so to look back throughout church history and see that continual pattern of God's grace and compassion and love for the church gives me a ton of hope. because then I see the difficult things that our church faces today, and I have renewed faith in God. Like, He's got us, no matter what the difficulties our church faces today. So 2, you gain a new perspective on the church. And then 3 is you gain a bigger understanding of our Protestant brothers and sisters. And I think that's really important for dialogue between different Christian denominations, and evangelization, and keeping your own faith. If you want to keep your own faith, you need to know why you believe what you believe and why others believe what they believe. But going a little deeper into this point of understanding our Protestant brothers and sisters more, currently, according to the Association of Religious Data Archives, there are around 200 major Protestant church categories. So that doesn't mean individual Protestant churches, but different categories for denominations, around 200. And then there are over 35,000 independent or non-denominational churches, each of which profess to hold the same singular authority, the Bible. Before advancing on this point, I do want to take a moment to acknowledge that there are 24 churches in union with Rome that make up the Catholic Church. And sometimes people call these Catholic denominations, but they are categorically different than Protestant denominations. Catholic denominations are all in union with Rome. There is the Latin Church, which uses the Latin Rite, and that's pretty much the one we're all familiar with. If you go to St. John's, we use the Latin Rite. We are part of the Roman Catholic Church. And then there are 23 Eastern Catholic churches, which is different than Eastern Orthodox. Eastern Catholic churches are in communion with the Pope. So there are 14 of these that use the Byzantine Rite. Then there are 3 that use the West Syriac Rite and 2 that use the East Syriac Rite, which look very similar. 3 use the Alexandrian Rite, down there, and then 1 uses the Armenian Rite, down there. You can see they look a little bit different from our Latin Rite, but all of these different rites are in communion with Rome, so they're all united under the Bishop of Rome, the Pope. A rite is a specific tradition of liturgy. For example, the Byzantine Rite, they stand during the entire Mass. They use a lot more sensory items in their liturgy. If you can look there at the picture of the Byzantine Rite, they're very visual, there's a lot of decoration and a lot of focus on using the physical to point to the immaterial and the spiritual. And that's kind of something that can be found in all the different Eastern churches and the different rites that they use. So if you ever think Father Umberto and Father Daniel are going a little bit crazy and a little bit overboard with the incense, like, you have not been to an Eastern Rite liturgy yet. And you can go to one if you want. There's a Byzantine Rite church in Denver if you want to experience that. So like the Byzantine church has more fasts and has different rules for their priests. So Eastern churches have a different looking liturgy, but share the same Catholic theology and sacraments, and very importantly, they are united under the Pope. So the Pope is their head authority, just like he is for the Latin Rite. So anyways, if you ever hear someone talking about Catholic denominations, just know that it's very different from Protestant denominations. Protestant denominations are all independent and not united under one authority. Okay. So I think especially for going back to the point of how there are 35,000 different independent and non-denominational Protestant churches, I think especially for Catholics who have been born and raised Catholic, and I know I was this way, it seemed mind-boggling to me how anyone was Protestant, because it made no sense to me. I was like, they say they have a singular authority, the Bible, and yet they are utterly divided. Obviously, their single authority is not working out for them. Why? I mean, yeah, I didn't know a lot about Protestantism. So in my youth, I was like, why would anyone be a Protestant? Like, that's just dumb. I don't get why anyone would do that. Clearly, Catholicism makes so much more sense. And I do believe that. But when you learn more about the Reformation and how it came about, it gives you an understanding that not all Protestants are just crazy. There are reasons for why the Reformation happened, and understanding these reasons both sheds light on our own Catholic faith and our Protestant brothers and sisters. And that's important for knowing why we believe what we believe and how to defend that, and knowing why Protestants believe what they believe and why we think that's wrong, why we think that wrong. Okay. So those are my 3 reasons for why I really like talking about this period of history. Theological discussions, understanding and getting a new perspective on our church history, and then being able to understand our Protestant brothers and sisters more. Before beginning, I want to acknowledge a few things. 1, I do not have a master's in history, and I am not an expert on this period of history. I did my undergrad in exercise science and philosophy, and I did my master's in philosophy. I learned about the Protestant Reformation while going through that education, and I've read up on it, and I love to learn about it on my own. But I just want to cite here that I am not a doctor of history, and as such, am not the foremost expert in this area. And the lessons I'm going to do on it are not, especially since we're covering kind of going over 500 years of history, they're not going to be crazy in depth, because otherwise we would only be able to cover maybe a century of the church. So that's the first thing. Second, I think when we look at this period of church history, it's important before we start to recognize that the Catholic Church is a refuge for sinners and not a club for saints. I know in my youth, I was almost hesitant to read about church history sometimes, because you would read about times when the church was involved in some icky things. We, church leaders, have committed sin, and we need to just reckon with that and realize that being a member of the Catholic Church does not mean you're perfect. And being a priest in the Catholic Church doesn't mean you're perfect. And being a leader, being the Pope of the Catholic Church, does not mean you're perfect. Maybe we'll talk about this later, but the doctrine of infallibility does not mean that the Pope never sins or that the Pope never says or does anything wrong. The leaders of the church throughout history have been corrupt, power-hungry, deceitful, weak, prideful, arrogant, lazy, greedy, basically name any vice, and there has been a church leader that has been that thing, and probably many other things. It's important to not pretend like members of the church have never done anything bad, or have had corrupt leaders or difficult time periods where the church was really wounded. And for 2 reasons. We do not want to perpetuate this idea that everyone in the church is perfect, because then when people who are not in the church see someone who is Catholic do something wrong, as we will eventually do because we're not perfect and we're still sinners, then they see it as a discredit to the church. If they think that the church says that they're perfect and everyone in it is perfect, and then they see Catholics sinning, then what conclusion can they have but that the people of that church are liars, or that the church doesn't really have authority? And then 2, if we don't acknowledge that we do make mistakes, and we have had periods of history where we made mistakes, we make ourselves vulnerable to repeating those things. We can't grow from them, and we can't learn from them, and we can't have them be these periods of purification and renewal and strengthening that God used them to be. We don't want to hear the past mistakes of the church and feel despair, because It's an opportunity to see God's love and faithfulness and mercy and awesome power, not to get really upset that the church couldn't be perfect all the time, always. And that really reflects the attitude that we should take towards our own selves and our own lives. When we see that we aren't perfect and that we make mistakes and that we will continue to make mistakes, that isn't cause for despair, but rather cause for praise, that in our weakness, God's glory and love and mercy can be shown. It has an opportunity to work, because though we are so weak, God can use us to do amazing holy things. And similarly, though the church is often so weak because it's composed of humans, God can use it to do wonderful, amazing things. St. Francis of Assisi said this quote where he said, "I have been all things unholy, and yet God made him a saint." So we should not feel despair when we look back at the church, the history of the church, from when it first started up until today. We shouldn't look at the church's mistakes and weaknesses and feel despair, but rather the church has been all things unholy, and yet God continues to mediate his grace to his people through his church. And that is beautiful. That is incredible and awesome, and should be a cause for joy because it demonstrates God's incredible love. Okay, last thing. Just a small bureaucratic matter. I wanted to have this be a live stream for two reasons. One, because I think if I actually recorded the video and then tried to edit it and put it up, I would just absolutely hate having to watch myself talk and never want to put anything up on YouTube. And so nothing would ever actually get posted. But two, so people could ask questions live. So in the live chat next to the live stream, anytime you guys want to ask a question, feel free to type it in. You will have to own the question, I'm afraid. I have no medium as of yet for anonymous questions. But I will say there is a 15-second lag, so I won't see your question until I've started talking about another topic. Because of that, I might finish the section and then answer questions, all the questions that were directed towards that section. But please, 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 feel free, and I would love it if you posted questions in the little live comments section. Okay, we are starting early. So the Reformation occurs roughly around 1450. We are going to go back and start at basically 1050 because it's really important to set the stage for why the Reformation happened. Basically, the class is going to go like first 3 weeks. What factors in the world led to the world stage being ripe for the Protestant Reformation? It was a tinderbox ready for a match to get lit and a flame to just jump up. There were a lot of factors that contributed to that, and it's really important to understand what happened and why it happened and how it happened, to understand what was going on in the centuries prior to the Reformation that made the church very vulnerable to this happening. And then we'll actually talk about the Reformation itself, various leaders in the Reformation, and how the main Protestant churches, the historical main Protestant churches, were established. And then we'll talk about the Catholic response. I don't know if you can hear the train is going by. Good old Longmont train. Okay, so first we're going to start with late Middle Age themes that led to the Reformation. And specifically, we're talking about tonight the Investiture Controversy. Okay. Oh, and also live streaming, this is all very new to me. I have this very cool software that lets me do things like have these images pop up on screen, which is very fun, but kind of a lot to manage. Mostly, I just hope there's some point during this whole course where I can use the air horn, because that sounds very fun. But if anything seems a little clunky, it's because I'm still trying to figure it out. Okay, Investiture Controversy. So this controversy really occurs from the period like 1075 to 1120. 1075 is kind of a rough number though, because there were a lot of things going on before 1075 that led to a beginning of the Investiture Controversy. But if we keep like going back and being like, well, this event made this event happen and this event made this event happen, we'd have to go back to Jesus, and that would just take way too long. The Investiture Controversy is all about who gets to appoint religious offices. So things like abbots and bishops and even the Pope. The church at the time was very, very powerful. 50% because of the fact that it was so intertwined with the state. State powers, secular powers, like being a ruler and that kind of thing, owning land, that was very intertwined with the church, and the church was very intertwined with who got to be the state and secular powers. This created a lot of difficulties. State officials were appointing a lot of religious offices like bishops and abbots, and people who were really high up, like kings and emperors. They even demanded to have a say, and did have a say, in who got to become pope. And this was problematic because it perpetuated a lot of corruption. Simony, Simony, thankfully we don't hear about it as much now, but simony was a really big problem back then, and simony is where you sell a church office. So say somebody else wants to be the Archbishop of Denver, and Bishop Aquila took a nasty turn and decided, okay, I'm going to sell it to my husband, Ellis Kuhn. Ellis Kuhn wants to be Archbishop of Denver, and Archbishop Aquila sells it to him. We pay $1 million that we don't have, and Ellis now gets to be the Bishop of Denver. That's what simony looks like, but back then it was more like Ellis would be the son of some king, and then the king would pay the money so that Ellis could become a bishop. This created a lot of corruption because a lot of times the people who became bishops and who became abbots weren't actually even priests, weren't holy men. They were just like the king's best friend or the king's nephew or the king's son or a noble who he owed a favor to. And it would often be not the king's firstborn son, but the secondborn son, who he couldn't be king because he had an older brother who was going to be king, but the king still wants to give him some sort of powerful position, so he buys him a bishopric. This obviously created a lot of issues because instead of bishops with allegiance and having their number one priority be God, it was whatever king or ruler got them their cozy spot as bishop of wherever. So their priorities in taking care of their flock and their people were lacking, and they didn't make for the best bishops. Worse, if these bishops got to very high up positions and got into Rome, they could influence church canon laws or church positions on things so that it would be favorable to whatever ruler they wanted to appease. In the Middle Ages, being a bishop was not like it is now. You had a lot of wealth and it was a really desirable status. A lot of times it came with land and almost kind of a ruling power over that land. You weren't officially a noble or a secular ruler or anything like that, but unofficially you often had a lot of that type of power. So it was seen as kind of a way to be a noble or a lord without actually having to have the title of noble or lord, because maybe because of the line of succession you couldn't have that. And then also, since a substantial amount of wealth and land was associated with the office of bishop or abbot, this is how it kind of got perpetuated as being sold to the next highest bidder, because it was kind of a product that people wanted to buy, like buying land, buying the church's property. It was also an important source of income for leaders of the nobility. So maybe a noble was kind of the puppet master in terms of who would be the next bishop. The noble was the one controlling that. Well, if he gets to sell off that position again and again, that's a great source of income. He doesn't have to do much. He's basically just appointing another leader who's going to be loyal to him, and he gets paid tons of money for it. So the nobles loved it. The corrupt bishops who gained these positions loved it because they didn't really have to do much except be rich and well connected to get this position of power. So for the wealthy and upper class, the ruling class, this was a great gig. Then this entanglement of the church and state caused a lot of problems. What was the church's role when the state went to war? If a noble or a lord decided to go to war with another noble or lord, what was the bishop supposed to do if that noble was the one who appointed him? Was he supposed to encourage all of his faithful, even though it was contrary to church teaching, to go to war? The nobles would often put pressure on the bishops to preach according to what was convenient for that noble, to support that noble's causes, regardless of whether it actually matched up with the church's position or theology. Politics got really messy. It was very difficult for the church to handle military and political fighting because so much of the church wasn't just devoted to God. So much of these church leaders were devoted to this particular noble or that particular noble or whatever ruler or king had gotten them their cozy position. The Gregorian reformers were a group that started around in this 11th century, the 1000s, that was trying to get rid of state interference in the church because of all the corruption that it was leading to. If you are a bishop whose priorities aren't God and you have no theological training, you're basically just, the king's best friend, drinking buddy, who he happened to pop into a nice, cozy bishopric position, you're not exactly going to be the most moral. And the church really had a ton of problems with priests living kind of depraved lives during this time period. There was tons of adultery, of priests having common law wives or different affairs, illegitimate children. There was, the practice of simony, a lot of using church lands for gain, making money off of it. Just really abusing their power and having no place in their heart for God, but just for worldly things, for more money, more possessions, and any kind of worldly pleasure. There were a few saints who wrote about this time period who called it utterly depraved. And there's a book, I can't remember, but it was something like the book of some word for terrible sin that was written during this period that was maybe a little bit exaggerated, but it really talked about this time period as if it was just the worst thing that had ever happened to the church, the worst time in the church, calling the church empty, drained of life. So it was a bad time. There were issues. Hence, in come the Gregorian reformers, who are trying to address this entanglement of the state with church and get rid of all this corruption that they saw among their bishops, their abbots, and their priests. An opportunity came for these people well, I should say their first target was to get rid of the practice that the Holy Roman Emperor had of having a sway over who became Pope. Earlier on, the Holy Roman Emperor, because of the connection with the initial Roman Empire, which had by this time disintegrated, and the Holy Roman Empire was nothing in comparison to the power of the actual Roman Empire. But anyways, I digress. Because of that authority that the Holy Roman Emperor claimed from back when Constantine was emperor, he said that he had a right to influence who was Pope. To be fair, there was a lot that the Holy Roman Emperor had at stake in the decision of who became Pope, because the Pope, in turn, had a big influence on who became emperor. So the emperor is trying to influence the Pope because the Pope influences the emperor, and each one is trying to get the upper hand. And that will continue as we see throughout this investiture controversy. But so an opportunity comes in 1056. See, it actually starts before 1075. An opportunity comes in 1056 when King Henry IV assumes the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. King Henry IV is just 6 years old, though, so the Gregorian reformers and the Pope at that time are like, great, a 6-year-old is the Holy Roman Emperor. This is a great time to make it official that the emperor has absolutely no role in who is elected Pope. In 1059, a church council in Rome declared, with the encyclical In Nomine Domini, that leaders of the nobility would have no part in the selection of popes. No popes. And created the College of Cardinals. So this is when the College of Cardinals is first created and comes into being, as a body of electors made up entirely of church officials, no state officials. Of course, that doesn't solve the problem that many church officials were actually state officials in disguise, but at least there was a law in place now, a canon law, that said state officials have no role in who becomes Pope. Only the College of Cardinals, who are purely church officials, have that job and have that power. Once Rome first regained control of the election of the Pope, it could turn its attention to the election of bishops and abbots, which was the next problem. And it was more ready to attack this practice of simony. Remember, that's the selling of bishoprics on a larger scale. So it takes Henry IV a while, because he starts out as a 6-year-old, but eventually Henry IV realizes that he has had a precious bit of power taken away from him. And he kind of feels taken advantage of. Like, I was 6 years old. You didn't even give me a chance to fight back against this. You took advantage of a child. So he is not pleased at having his right to appoint popes and have that taken away. Because again, the Pope was the one who got to crown the next Holy Roman Emperor, so that mutual influence was at stake. Pope Gregory VII is now on the scene. Pope Gregory VII, originally named Hildebrand, he was a guy that had, for 20 years before he became Pope, he was a huge player in getting reforms underway. He kind of was a big advisor to the popes before he himself became Pope, and was responsible for kind of creating and driving a lot of the initial Gregorian reforms that cracked down on priest behavior. Gregory VII absolutely hated, I forgot I had my little pictures here. Gregory VII, right there. He hated all the corruption that he saw in the priests. Over here we have Henry IV. Our key players, Henry IV. Where was I? Oh, Gregory VII. Yeah, so eventually, though, he himself becomes Pope. He really didn't want to be Pope. It's actually interesting how many priests don't want to be bishops or popes or cardinals. But if you talk to them, it kind of makes sense, right? The more power you get, the more angry emails you probably get. No, but it's a lot of responsibility. And I think it is very wise for people who have to kind of consider taking on that responsibility to be wary of it, because that means they know themselves, they know they're imperfect, and it is scary to take on such a big role and have that much responsibility if you know yourself really deeply and know your weaknesses, because it makes you feel like, how could I possibly do this? So, and then there's so much bureaucracy too. Gregory VII does become Pope though, and in 1075, he publishes another papal bull called the Dictatus Papae, which declares that the Pope is the only one with the authority to appoint bishops. And to this day, the Pope is the only one with the authority to appoint bishops. He has groups and committees that kind of do research and create reports and then present it all to the Pope, but the Pope is the one who makes the final decision of, yes, this is the person who's going to be bishop. So Gregory VII, over there, officially declares the Pope is the only one with the authority to appoint bishops. This practice of secular rulers appointing their own buddy bishops has to stop because it's leading to rampant corruption. Okay. Henry IV is not pleased. He wasn't pleased already because his right to appoint the Pope had been, or to influence who was the Pope had been taken away. But now the Pope was saying he couldn't even appoint his own bishops. Not pleased at all. Gregory's Dictatus Papae is the last straw for Henry IV, and he decides to incite a protest against Gregory. He wants to get this guy out of here. No good. He's not helping me run a stable kingdom where I can kind of control the bishops and retain a lot of central authority. He's got to go. He declares that Gregory is a terrible pope and must abdicate the chair of St. Peter. And he writes to Gregory with some spicy words. He says, oh no, that's Gregory's. He says, "Thou, therefore, damned by this curse and by the judgment of all our bishops and by our own, descend and relinquish the apostolic chair which thou hast usurped." So powerful words from the Holy Roman Emperor. And he's not totally wrong when he says, by the judgment of all our bishops, because in Germany, where the Holy Roman Emperor is residing and ruling, most of the bishops have been appointed by Henry IV. So when he says the judgment of all his bishops is against Gregory, he is totally right, because all of Henry IV's bishops are in Henry IV's pocket. So after writing this letter, Henry goes further and calls for the Synod of Worms. A synod is just kind of like a council, a meeting where you're going to decide something. There's a lot of synods in this history course, so just be prepared for a lot of synods. So at the Synod of Worms, Henry IV calls together all the German bishops, and 2/3 come. So that tells you 2/3 of the German bishops were in the pocket of Henry IV, and they were totally on board with just ousting Gregory VII, because Henry was against him. But not only that, a lot of the bishops, especially the ones who were corrupt and had been appointed by state officials, did not love Gregory VII, which makes sense because Gregory VII was all about calling bishops out, getting rid of those who were corrupt. If you had inherited your bishopric, if you had gotten it by simony, by any other means that wasn't the Pope appointed you, you were out of there. You were supposed to be gone. And he had a lot of strict rules for any bishops that were found to be not living celibacy. So not that popular with all the bishops who were corrupt. Did not love him. So at this Synod of Worms, 2/3 of the German bishops show up and they say, yep, we vote him out. He's done. We totally agree. We'll put our names on it. Gregory VII is the worst. I hate that guy. He's always going on about how I shouldn't be drinking all the time. Let's do away with him. This is a great example of why Gregory VII needs the bishop's loyalty to be to God and not to any king. And also not to worldly pleasures, not to corruptions. So the bishops make up a ton of ridiculous false accusations, called calumny. Calumny is when someone speaks wrongly about you, like says something terrible and made up about you. And they're trying to ruin Gregory's credibility. They're trying to tell everybody else in Germany, yeah, this guy is the worst. He doesn't deserve to be Pope. Let's get him out of here. The situation was then made even more dire when Henry IV decided to make his own personal chaplain the Bishop of Milan, even though the Pope had already appointed a Bishop of Milan there. So now Henry is directly and flagrantly going out and appointing rival bishops, directly challenging the Pope's authority to appoint bishops. So what's at stake here, it's getting pretty dire, because it's, do kings and lords appoint the bishops, or does the Pope? What is the purpose of a bishop? So this is kind of the last straw for Gregory VII. He's like, now you're appointing rival bishops. This is causing mass confusion. I'm done with you. I'm done with you. And he has really some even spicier words for Henry IV. He excommunicates Henry from the church, which is a big deal, and I'll talk about that in a second. But he says, on the strength of this belief, therefore, for the honor and security of thy church, in the name of Almighty God, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, I withdraw through thy power and thy authority from Henry the King, son of Henry the Emperor, who has risen against thy church with unheard of insolence, the rule over the whole kingdom of the Germans and over Italy. I absolve all Christians from the bonds of the oath which they have made or shall make to him, and I forbid anyone to serve him as king. So this is a big deal. Excommunication nowadays, Excommunication nowadays doesn't hold the same exact weight, because there aren't rulers who insist that they have divine power given to them from God to rule over their estate. Or there might be some rulers who still believe that, but they are in the minority. Excommunication nowadays just means you can't go to Mass, you can't receive the sacraments, and that is really dire and really terrible. But it was a different sort of dire and terrible for the kings and rulers of this age, because when you were excommunicated, the Pope stripped you of your right to rule. So as Gregory says in here, he absolves all Christians from the bonds of the oath which they have made or shall make to him, and he forbids anyone who's a Christian to serve him as their king. So what Gregory VII has done in excommunicating Henry is said, you are not a ruler anymore. You have no right to rule. No Christian has any allegiance to you or any binding obligation to obey you. Henry can't go to masses. He can't go to religious festivals. Holy people are not to fraternize with Henry. And this was a really big issue for Henry, because immediately after he gets excommunicated, the lords and nobles under him are already starting to rebel, build their own forts, overthrow different rulings and systems that Henry IV had, because they're like, oh great, he doesn't have any authority, he doesn't have any power. We're going to usurp that power since it's now up for grabs. So this is dire for Henry IV. It's not just that he can't receive the sacraments. He symbolically has been stripped of his right to rule, and back then that stripping had real effects. Like, people did not take you seriously anymore if your power has been stripped by the Pope and you've been excommunicated. That's an important thing to keep in mind throughout the course of history. When the Pope excommunicates a ruler, that is serious for that ruler, because it weakens their authority and makes them really vulnerable to rebellion from their people. So he's excommunicated, and as his Holy Roman Empire starts to dive into chaos, Henry's like, oh geez, I really gotta fix this fast, or else I'm not going to be Henry IV anymore. I will just be regular Henry of nothing. So in 1077, Henry travels all the way down. I'm gonna bring Henry back up for us. Henry travels all the way back down to Italy to grovel before the Pope, Some accounts say that Henry stood outside of Gregory VII's house for days, barefoot in the snow. Did that actually happen? I don't know. It's not that important. The point is, Henry had to grovel and say he was begging for forgiveness. I'm so sorry, I was so in the wrong. You're so right. The Pope is the only one who should appoint bishops. I'm such an idiot. So Gregory lifts the excommunication, says, very good, my son, you may go back. But Henry is a total liar. Immediately after he leaves, as soon as Henry is reinstated with his authority to rule, Henry decides to just name his own pope. He says Gregory is totally illegitimate, and actually whose pope is Clemens III. So his German bishops who were in his pocket decide to appoint Clemens III as the rival pope. Why does Henry do this? Because he's like, in order to have a right to rule, I have to have some pope saying that I have the divine authority. I hate Gregory VII, so clearly when I get angsty, he's not going to give me the right to rule. So I need to come up with my own pope who's going to tell all my people that yes, indeed, God has given me the power to rule. So his solution for this is just to appoint a new pope who will reassure all of his people, oh, no, he's not excommunicated. That other guy is totally illegitimate. Don't listen to him. He's fine. He has the divine right. Not only does he do this, but then he invades Italy in 1081 with his own armies. So he is marching to Rome with his armies ready to take down Gregory VII. He returns with a vengeance. Gregory is in a tough position. This is probably why he didn't want to be pope. This is the reason he wanted to resist it so much. Gregory has to ask the Normans in France to come down to Rome to help protect the papacy. The Normans were kind of a Viking people, who lived up in France. And they did come down, and they did successfully defend Rome, and they repelled Henry IV and his army. Unfortunately, after they did that, the Normans decided to stay, and they sacked and pillaged and looted the city of Rome. This made all the Romans very annoyed at Gregory VII for inviting these Normans there in the first place, and he had a sharp decrease in popularity. This fighting goes on between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor. Henry IV eventually dies. Gregory VII eventually dies, but their successors continue this investiture controversy. Remember, it goes from 1075, when Gregory first declares the Dictatus Papae, to 1120. And in 1120, they have the Concordat of Worms. At this point, Henry is dead, Gregory is dead, and their successors are the ones continuing this fight and now trying to broker this peace at the Concordat of Worms. Remember, we had the Synod of Worms. This is now the Concordat of Worms. There might be a difference. I don't really know. They're just meetings at Worms. I guess they do strike a peace, a concord, you could say. So maybe that's the difference. But in 1122, they finally saw a compromise. The compromise, though, was very weak and only sort of solved the problem. We had an agreement that the Pope would appoint the bishops. Yes, okay, Pope is the one who's going to appoint the bishops. However, the Holy Roman Emperor managed to keep in there that state officials had an unofficial say in influencing these decisions. So basically the agreement was like, okay, yes, on paper, the Pope gets to appoint the bishops, but also secular rulers still get to have an unofficial say, and that unofficial say might eventually become the deciding factor. Is that cool? Okay, great. So it was a compromise, but it wasn't a compromise. It solved the problem, but it didn't solve the problem. And indeed, the practice of simony and corrupt bishops and corrupt priests, through Gregorian reforms, it was made a lot better, and there were a lot of reforms in the church that helped the dire situation that the church was in the 10th and 11th centuries. But the the conclusion of the Investiture Controversy was not strong enough to completely protect the church and completely get rid of state interference and influence over church happenings. And this will affect the church in the 1400s when the Reformation does occur. The ripples of this corruption and the issues of priests being so interested in worldly things will ripple into the 1400s and affect the direction that the Reformation goes in. After the dust settles from all of this, the Holy Roman Emperor's authority was definitely weakened. And like I said before, the Holy Roman Empire was not exactly the strongest empire in the first place, because it's really a king ruling over a bunch of other rulers. In the long term, the area of Germany was never strongly united throughout all of history, or not all of history, but throughout a lot of medieval history. You'll hear about France and the King of France and the kings and queens in Spain and the kings and queens in England. And then there's Germany and the Holy Roman Empire, who was the king but didn't have really that much power. And it's because Germany was pretty divided. And the Investiture Controversy played a part in kind of definitively relegating the Holy Roman Empire to that kind of divided and not strongly united status. The church won a victory, but only a partial victory. Like I said, it helped. It definitely helped to have on the records in canon law that the Pope appoints the bishops, but it was not a decisive victory. It did not completely get rid of state interference in the workings of the church. Rulers still held a good deal of unofficial authority over the appointment of bishops. They could, for instance, veto a bishop that they did not think would support their power or their policies, or where they wanted to go in general with their kingdom. So, big picture takeaway from this is how deeply involved the church was with the state, or the state was with the church. I used to, when I was young, I'm going to be saying that a lot. I definitely have a habit of being like, when I was young, I used to think this. So I'm just preparing you. I like to talk about my childhood beliefs, and you're going to be hearing a lot of them. Starting with this one. When I was young, I used to wish that we lived in a theocracy. I was like, if the Pope was president or king and just everyone was Catholic and we just had bishops be like the governors, then the world would be the perfect place because, just everyone would be Catholic and the rulers would do all the Catholic things and be super nice to everyone. But you look at history and you're like, the church having a ton of secular power like that, secular ruling power, hurts the church because it's hard for church leaders to maintain singular allegiance to God when there are so many temptations to greed and to power and to corruption and just to the world in general. So looking at church history, I'm definitely happy that we have a separation of church and state. Not because I'm scared of the state being infected by the church, but I'm scared of the church being infected by the state. We want to protect the church and our leaders within the church from having to suffer those temptations, because it just makes their job a lot harder. Okay, that is everything for this evening on the Investiture Controversy. I haven't seen any comments for questions, so I will give you guys a couple more minutes just in case you had a question and hadn't typed it. And while I'm giving you that time, I'll just kind of go with a maybe more in-depth outline of what we're planning on doing. So next week, same time, same place, same person, we'll be talking about continuing late Middle Age themes that led to the Reformation, or maybe not led, but set the stage for the Reformation. Things like the Black Death, the rise of universities, scholasticism, printing press, everything that went on with indulgences and issues therein. Then we start to really get into the actual Reformation itself. We start with Luther. Then we'll talk about the Swiss Reformed branch of the Reformation, which had people like Zwingli and Calvin. We'll be doing then England and the English Reformation, and a little bit of the radical reformers, who didn't have like one specific guy who was driving them, but had a few different people. Then we'll go into the Catholic response, mainly focusing on the Council of Trent. If you want to access the recording after I'm done this live thing, I just click finish and it automatically uploads to Father Daniel's YouTube channel. So you can watch it from the beginning after basically I sign off and I'm gone. The whole recorded thing will be put on the internet, and I will never watch it ever myself because it will be very painful for me. But if you came in halfway through, you can watch from the beginning there. What is a good source of information on this subject? I don't know if any of you have ever read anything on newadvent.org. They have a lot of primary source materials, so like the actual letters that went on between, Henry IV and Gregory VII when they were having all these spicy arguments. And they have a lot of in-depth stuff on church history too. Like, we didn't talk about it at all, but just from the period of 1000 to 1050, the amount of craziness that was going down with the papacy and issues within the church is just ridiculous. And you can read all about it on that website. I think that's the most accessible, so that's one thing I'd recommend. But yeah, I think that's it for tonight. I hope you guys have a great rest of your evening, and I'm looking forward to seeing everyone next week. Thank you.